Hi there, welcome back to Essentials of Game Design. I'm Mary Brune, your instructor in the course, and I'm really excited about the topic for this week's discussion, game analysis. Game analysis, really understanding all the elements that are present in games, really gives you an opportunity to think strategically about how you want to create a game that is interesting and fun to play for your players. So whether or not you're aware of these terms that we're going to be covering, you are aware of the presence of these elements in the games that you probably play. And so we're going to start to look at things in the games that we'll play today in class, you'll start to look at them a little bit differently once you really understand what's going on behind the scenes. So the formal elements that we're going to be discussing today are players, objectives, procedures, rules, conflict, boundaries, and outcome. So within players, there are 4 different things you want to look at and consider: the invitation to play, the number of players, the role of players, and player interaction patterns. And we'll talk about each of those in turn now. So the invitation to play. This is something it could be as simple as a screen with graphical elements on it and a button that users just click to initiate the game. It could be almost a mini movie that incorporates some aspect of the game and really just draws the player in and excites them to play. Really, the level of detail you go into here is up to you. But the important thing is that you have something in the beginning of your game that really just sort of sets the stage for your player and gives them an idea of what your game is about. So we'll talk more about that when we're going through things in class. Number of players. This can vary depending on the kind of game that you're creating. So, you could have 2 players or 4 players or a multiplayer game. And the idea here is just to make sure that the mechanics of the game are suitable for the number of players that you're creating your game for. So that's just something to consider. So roles of players. You might have a game where you have every player has the same role, or you might have different players have different roles. For example, in the game, the board game Monopoly, there's someone who plays the banker, or someone who sort of manages the real estate assets, and then there's just the players who play along the board. And so if you do have a game where you have multiple roles for players, just ensuring that there's balance and that it's clear about what those different roles contain. So player interaction patterns, these are an example, just examples of several patterns that you might see in games that you can play, and you can decide as you're creating your game what you want to include. Single player versus game, a game like Solitaire is a great example of that. Multiple individual players, so many players playing the same game individually. Player versus player, playing against someone. Unilateral competition, where many people are playing against one opponent. And multilateral competition, where many people are playing against each other. And then cooperative play, where people are playing toward an end goal and they're helping one another in order to achieve that ultimate outcome. So objectives. The point of your game. So why it is the players are playing, what they hope to achieve in the game. That's pretty straightforward. So just making sure that you have some clear objective for the player. So for example, here's some examples of objectives. So in Pac-Man, the Pac-Man's goal is to eat all the dots in the maze without getting attacked by ghosts and pick up some bonus points along the way for eating those bouncing strawberries. So Super Mario Brothers, the objective here might be to rescue Princess Toadstool from Evil Bowser by completing all 32 levels of the game. So that's an example of that objective. And for Frogger, for example, you might have the objective of getting all 5 frogs safely to their lily pads before the time runs out and without being hit by a vehicle or drowned by a turtle. So those are examples of some objectives that that you might have. Let me go back a little bit. Sorry about that. Okay, so procedures. These are how the players actually play the game, what steps they need to do to follow in order to meet their objectives. And then rules. These are sort of how gameplay proceeds. And so, for example, like rolling the dice or picking a card, moving around the board. If you're, talking about a board game, these are just how the users and the players rather need to proceed in the game. And it's really important that when you have rules that you don't have unstated rules or things that you think the player is going to just pick up or understand. It can become confusing and challenging and frustrating for the players if they don't clearly understand what it is they need to do to proceed through the game. So as you're going to be moving on in this class and creating your own ideas for games, part of the process of that will be to write down very specifically the rules of play for your game. So resources, these are just the most common resources that you would find in games. You've probably played lots of games that had at least some or maybe more of these in your games. Lives, for example, the Pac-Man and Frogger examples I gave earlier use lives as a resource. Units, health, currency, actions, power-ups, inventory, special terrain, and time. So those are all examples of resources that you could use in various ways in your games. So conflict. There are various kinds of conflict that you might have in your games, and these are common examples that you might use. Obstacles, things that your players need to overcome. Opponents that you need to fight against. So alien invasion is a great example of that. Dilemmas, just choices that your players, your characters in the game are facing. So you have to decide to do one thing over another. Those are great examples of how to create conflict in your game that makes it challenging and interesting for your players to continue playing. So boundaries. Establishing sort of clearly what is part of the game, what's not part of the game. There's sort of the physical space of boundary that you might think of, considering a football field, or say you have objects in your game that are useful to the players and that actually mean something versus just decoration for the scene. So thinking about what's clearly defined as being part of the game play and what is not. Sorry. So outcome. The outcome is something that, what's the ultimate ending of your game, and, how to reach that. If it were super clear to the player, sorry, this cursor is, I just want to make sure that you can see the screen as I'm seeing the screen. So the outcome of the game, if it's really clear what the player needs to do in order to reach that ultimate outcome, it's going to get a little bit boring. So you do need to ensure that there is sufficient challenge in your game in order to keep the players interested in working toward that ultimate outcome. So along those lines, that leads a great segue into the dramatic elements of games. So in regard to those, we have challenge, play, premise, character, story, world building, and the dramatic arc. And we'll talk about each of those a little bit here. So the tasks that are most satisfying to complete are ones that require just the right amount of work to create a sense of accomplishment. So you want the player to have to work for something, but not too hard, because if they work too hard for something or they're just trying it over and over again, they can't get past a level, it can create some frustration and make them walk away from play. Similarly, if they try something and there's just no challenge at all and they're able to do it from the beginning, they're going to get bored and they're not going to play. So you have to find the sweet spot in between those two extremes in order to make your game challenging and yet really fun to play. So play. Just keeping it simple, keeping it fun, creating just an atmosphere of enjoyment in your games that keeps your players wanting to play. So the premise. This, is something that really just helps to establish, where your game is taking place, what's happening, the why and how kind of your game. And so it's kind of helps to root the action that propels your story forward and gives your characters just a little bit more depth in terms of why they're doing what they're doing. And speaking of characters, characters are sort of the ones who are actually carrying out the actions and as the drama of your story and your game is unfolding. And so the characters are defined by what they say themselves, what they do, the actions they take, and what they look like, their physical appearance, what equipment they might have, and what other people maybe in the game might say about them. So just like in a novel or a story you would read, the main character is your protagonist and works against those working against that main character are the antagonists. So making sure that you're really clear who your main characters in the story are and that what they're wearing and how they're presented in the game truly does reflect who they are and what they're doing. So along that line, not every game has a really overarching story that's super strong. Some of them do. Like, for example, I mentioned Frogger. You want to get this frog across the street through the river to their lily pad for safety. There isn't a whole lot behind that. The frog wasn't lost and away from its family. There wasn't like this really deep backstory about how that frog ended up out of the pond, out of the river, and across the other side of the street. That might be interesting to know, sort of what that frog's motivations are for having to get back to the lily pad. So think about when you're creating your game, what the backstory might be. What happened to get the character to that point to where they're trying to meet this objective in the game. And that can just help, again, deepen understanding on the part of the players, have them feel invested in really helping the character in order to reach that goal. So world building, not every game sort of has an aspect of world building, but those like Farmville and Minecraft and some of those other games that really, even Civilization Revolution, where you're deep in the middle of this world that's been created for you. That's sort of what speaks to world building, and whether or not you choose to include that in your game that you design is up to you. Dramatic arc. So again, a dramatic arc might be most obvious in sort of a multiplayer sort of quest kind of game where you would actually see, the rising action, a climax, and falling action, and sort of as you work through the game, you may or may not. But it depends really on the type of game that you want to create. But if you are creating some kind of epic story-based game, just being sure that you do have that kind of classic dramatic arc pattern in your game in order to really keep your players engaged. Okay, so that is it for this week of game analysis. So what I want you to do is to post 3 story ideas to the discussion forum, and we're going to create a list of games that we can use as we're going through and conducting the analysis of the games. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in class. Take care.